Is gain staging really necessary in a modern DAW? We had a lot of comments on our recent video on how to prepare your mix for mastering that said if your mix bus is clipping, you can simply bring the master fader down and the DAW's 32 or 64-bit floating point internal architecture will take care of the rest, and voila, no more clipping, bounce out your mix. But is this true?
Yes, here we have a mix with all the plugins bypassed, and we can clearly see and hear that the output is clipping. There's two ways around this. We can pull all the channels down. Now we're not clipping, or we can put those back to 0 and we can bring the master fader down. Either way works, and you might want to bring the master fader down if you've got any post fader effect sends, or if you've got a ton of fader automation going on the channels and you don't want to risk breaking it.
But, and there's always a but. This all changes if you're using plugins, and specifically plugins that act in a non-linear fashion, such as analog modeling plugins.
So let's take the same mix and add some compression to each channel and some saturation. I've also added a limiter to the output to stop our output going above 0, because we never want that. And what have we got? Well, we've got a distorted, horrible mess. Now this is pretty extreme, but I do get mixes through that sound like this for mastering, and then often ask for the mix bus processors to be removed. And when the mix bus processing is removed, once again we're clipping. So the client brings the master fader down, and what have we got? A quieter, horrible distorted mess, and then I cry because it still sounds like crap, and that's because their gain staging is wrong.
So what is gain staging? Back in the analog days, gain staging was important to maintain a healthy signal to noise ratio so that the cumulative effect of noise generated by mixing consoles, outboard effects and tape didn't get out of control. But it was also just as important to make sure the signal level wasn't too hot, because this would cause distortion and everything would sound like the mix you just heard. There was a sweet spot, a level at which the equipment performed at its best, and it's still important to pay attention to that today at every stage in the process: recording, mixing and mastering. And whilst every modern DAW we can think of has at least 32-bit floating point internal processing, meaning that you can run an individual channel as hot as you like and then bring it down with the master fader and not have to worry about clipping, there are two key reasons why you should pay attention to gain staging. The first is just because it's good practice, and the second is because most analog modeling plugins are coded to respond in the same way to an input as the original gear did. If the level's too low, they won't perform as required and may even induce noise into the signal, although you can switch this feature off with many of them. And if the signal is too hot, then they'll clip and distort. So how does Mark sort his distorted, horrible mix out?
Once again, I go back to the source. The level going into the first plugin is too hot, and the level coming out of it and going into the second one is too hot, so even pulling the faders down won't fix this. The gain staging is wrong earlier on, and my plugins are clipping. Not only that, but my compressor's threshold is very much affected by the input, so it can be hard to get the compression I want if the signal is way too hot going in. So I can either reduce the gain of my individual audio files, but in Logic Pro this will destructively edit the source file, so if it's used in any other project or another mix version, for example, I'm going to have a problem with levels again. So what I can do is put a gain plugin at the beginning of the chain and then bring the levels down. So now I've put a gain plugin at the top of every channel, so it's the first thing in the signal chain after the raw audio itself, which isn't clipping, and I've brought the gain down on every channel, and we can see that now nothing's clipping, my plugins aren't clipping, and even with the limiter off, my output isn't clipping either.
And we don't have to worry about clipping the stock gain plugin because that operates in 32-bit floating point. So we could load a gain plugin and turn it up 3 dB, and then another one after it and turn that back down 3 dB, and repeat that 100 times, and we wouldn't degrade the audio. There are also practical considerations to take into account. If all your channels are so quiet that there's barely any movement on the meters, or so hot that they're all pinned into the red, then they're just not going to convey any useful visual information to you. So what's the best way to gain stage in a modern DAW if you've never done it before? We can start right at the beginning by making sure our recordings are set up correctly. Most engineers tend to aim for between -18 and -12 dBFS, as this ensures there's enough headroom to be able to process the audio in the correct manner, whilst also maintaining a high enough volume to have a good signal to noise ratio from your preamps and interface. If you can ensure as many channels as possible fall roughly within these ranges whilst recording, you're setting yourself up for success later in the project, as you'll have less work to do to get your audio to a workable level in the mix. If you forget and then start gain staging in the middle of the mix, one moment you could be getting 2 or 3 decibels of compression on your snare drum, and then the next moment you've got 50 decibels of compression on it, completely ruining your sound. We can check the levels if our plugins don't have metering built in by using a basic metering plugin. If we're using a VU or volume units plugin, we need to remember that this operates on a different scale to dBFS or full scale. So as a general rule, we want to stay in the ballpark of around -18 dBFS or 0 dB VU going into each plugin. We'll have a video coming on the different metering standards very soon. The same also applies for the mix bus. Run into any non-linear plugins at too high a level on that and you'll be faced with the same issues: distortion and the inability to shape the sound as intended. So make sure you're not going into this too hot. So whilst you can of course claim that if it sounds right, it is right, and technically that's probably true, it's worth learning how to gain stage. It might sound okay to level things in a very extreme way in your DAW or even pay no attention to it, but it's worth learning how to gain stage properly. Then if you send a track to Mark for mastering and he thinks it's a little over compressed and asks for a version without the mix bus processing on, you can just bypass it and not have to worry about levels. And to find out more about how to present your mix for mastering, whether it's to get a free test master from Mark, link is down in the description below, or run it through an online service such as LANDR, or indeed do it yourself, watch the video coming up on your screen right now.